CDAC Network focuses on building pathways for participation and a bridge between local expertise and evidence and global knowledge and guiding policy. So in a landscape that evolves as fast as we can learn, in this meeting we'll be looking at who we need and what we need to go beyond business as usual.
Through this meeting and the days that follow, we hope to draw out the conversation with others working on communication and engagement. The aims are broad, and we want to foster collaboration amongst us as we continue to work together, and we aim to identify tangible ways that can accelerate the conversation forwards. Now, before we head to our panel, we'll hear from our network members. And we asked them who the key collaborators should be in the future of engagement and communication. And let's see what they have to say now. Yep.
Most essential collaborators remain actually the communities that are affected, and that means refugees and host communities. And within this, we have women, we have girls, we have youth, we have children, we have unaccompanied minors, and persons also with disability. So I think these people must be looked at with, with an individuality, with specific response to their needs, which obviously would vary. So I think really the most important collaborators are the affected communities. So the second collaborators are the authorities, and you'll find in the context of the Kenya refugee operation, the authorities are the ones that make the policies that inform our response, how we can actually work with the communities. Our effort needs to continue with the authorities to ensure that they accord dignity to the affected communities through the different policies that they may make, and actually in the way they collaborate, in the way they work with us, and ensure that those communities are given the dignity and the space to work in a better way and to stay in a more dignified way.
When we support organizations, we really focus on the human side and the individuals, as well as on the skills that you may need to use certain tools like we support organizations to do, because that is really important, because they are change makers in those organizations and in those contexts. To change dynamics, to change the architecture, to change how people decide, and making real the participation revolution, making real all the commitments. It's about individuals. So in our experience, that is really, really fundamental. We don't have to forget that side of the sector that is built from human beings. That is really important, because many times people really work in silos, have no idea of what's happening. The comms team has no idea what's happening in planning or programmatic team or M&E, and that is the chances that you lose for doing really good work in one process that can not just be useful for all the different departments or areas of work, but also better understanding of the issues and the complexity, and being everybody on board.
For the international community, and particularly for the UN agencies and other major actors like that, I think the question for us and for those actors is not so much who are the collaborators, but how should we collaborate? And so we still see far too often that there's poor transparency of what different agencies are doing. And there can be this kind of protective or competitive or even secretive atmosphere, which is just wholly unhelpful when fast action is required in the face of an infectious disease or some other crisis. So I'd love to see partners be open about the work they're doing and the work that they're commissioning and who they're working with and how and what they're trying to get from it and how they're going to contribute to a whole. And if partners are actively engaging with communities, that they should approach or make themselves visible to nationally led structures to offer those contributions through a nationally integrated response plan.
CDAC as our main collaborator. I will start with CDAC, but then I would also go beyond CDAC and other humanitarian partners, including the clusters, and some of the clusters are led by UNICEF. So I would really think that the clusters and the other humanitarian partners, the collaboration with the community-based organizations, the collaboration with community structures itself and the communities, to make them part of the stakeholders, part of our partners, not just the people who are receiving our messages and our aids. And this is the only way we could build upon this wonderful collaboration that's been going on during so many emergencies, especially during the pandemic. And I think that this pandemic has also given us an opportunity to really think beyond just a response and look at broader community engagement on a continuous and consistent basis. Still, there is a huge opportunity because all the wonderful collaborations that we have created, coordination mechanisms that came up during pandemic as well, we could build on the momentum that already exists, and the partners are willing to collaborate far more than ever and also pool in resources. So there could be, I think, much better efforts for the future prevention of disasters.
No agency can do this alone. This is essentially teamwork in the broadest sense. Teams that reach across silos, sectors, clusters, agencies. Teams that are focused on our common objective to do everything in our power to prevent SEA and to respond effectively and swiftly when transgressions do occur. WHO values highly our membership in the CDAC network. We believe that collective action through CDAC can better embed CCA in all our work and draw on our collective expertise and experience.
So coming up on the panel today, we're really grateful to be joined by four experts on our panel today with quite different experiences to bring to this conversation around collaboration in community, in communication and engagement. So first up, there's Rakesh. And there's Dana. So first up, we have Dana Pavlychko. Dana is CEO for United for Ukraine and the owner of Osnovi Publishing. She left Kiev with her husband and 3 children at the start of the war in Ukraine. United for Ukraine is an innovative Swiss-based non-profit aimed at rebuilding Ukraine and providing emergency relief, humanitarian assistance, and essential information. United for Ukraine's key program is a pan-European refugee platform created with the support of Google and the International Rescue Committee. Dana is an alumna of the United World College of the Adriatic and also holds a master's degree in public policy from King's College London. Dana is also the host of How We Win This, a podcast about Ukrainian resilience. We also have Haile Hailu, who is UNHCR refugee coordinator. Haile came to Switzerland as a refugee from Ethiopia 13 years ago. His refugee status was recognized 6 years after entering the country, and during that time he achieved a master's degree in economics at the University of Bern. Since graduating, he has dedicated himself to working towards the integration and inclusion of refugees and other people of concern, with a particular focus on facilitating socioeconomic participation. In his current role, Haile acts as a focal point for refugee-led organizations and supports UNHCR to develop more participatory approaches across all its fields of work.
We have Rakesh Bharania. Is that correct? Okay. Rakesh Bharania. Rakesh Bharania is the president of Tarian Innovation and Humanitarian Technology Consultancy. He was previously director of Humanitarian Technology Impact at Salesforce.org, where he was responsible for defining engagement with the humanitarian community, focusing on the principled, safe, and ethical application of innovative technologies to accelerate humanitarian and development impact. Rakesh has spent more than 27 years in the humanitarian sector, focusing on the intersection of emerging technologies and international humanitarian crisis response and development, including roles with Apple and Cisco, where he helped to create one of the earliest private sector humanitarian technology response teams. And we have here with us Louisa Seferis, an independent expert on social accountability. Louisa is a humanitarian practitioner working across a range of conflicts and other crises since 2006. She currently focuses on market-based approaches, cash assistance, livelihoods, people-centered aid, and accountability, working for a number of humanitarian social protection actors as an independent consultant. Louisa has a master's degree in humanitarian assistance and conflict resolution from the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University and a bachelor's degree in international politics and justice and peace studies from the Walsh School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University. Welcome all, and thanks very much for joining us today.
Yes, thanks everyone. And let's work out together with our panel and with all of us in the room what collaboration on communication, community engagement and accountability will look like in the future. Can we, should we, and how could we rethink this? So to everyone in the room, listening in online around the world, please do feel free to use Slido to add any questions as we get, finally we start to hear less from us and more from our esteemed panelists. So Palwashay, over to you.
So we're talking today about collaboration in the future of communication and community engagement. And we welcome 4 quite different perspectives to the panel today. So let's start with some help from our panelists in framing this issue a bit more. Haile, I'd like to come to you first with a very broad question. Your role involves outreach with refugees in Switzerland. And when it comes to collaboration more broadly, what do you think we need to be thinking about to make engagement more effective?
I think what comes to my mind from connecting with refugee-led organizations in particular is first try to understand what their needs are, how they function, what their culture, the cultural background. Found that very critical in my mapping exercise, connecting with refugee-led organizations. My experience being a refugee myself and being different culture gave me some kind of clue. But as I go along, connect with the organizations, I understood what they want. The first priority is trust. They want to know who you are and what your motivations are. And unfortunately, they also have some trust broken experience past, because organizations, humanitarian organizations, come collect some information or advice and they disappear. And a lot of them are doing that without, communicating to each other. And the organizations, most of the organization leaders, the refugee-led organization leaders told me, they come, they disappear. You are one of them. You're from Tunisia, and we know you're not doing anything to help us. And so that was the thing. So what helped was, okay, I knew already, being a refugee myself, and the experience in the past working with refugee communities, I knew that it takes frequent contact, if possible, in person. If not in person, then make it visual so that it's an online video call or so. And frequently, and build trust gradually, even to let them to manage, get them participate in a survey, provide information. So I understand them. I was not judgmental because my background also helped. Why would they worry? Why would they spend their time filling out a survey that they don't know what it serves, how it serves them? So this is what I would say in short. And cultural elements also play very, very, very important. I will come back to that later.
The consistency in communication and coordination, I believe, is key, in following up, in ensuring that, they're being heard and whatever they're contributing in terms of information, that's being used and addressed effectively.
Yeah, maybe if I have to add some point. I'm thankful to the UNHCR that they trusted my approach.
Right.
When it comes to organizations, you don't have resources, time. You want to do it so fast within a short period of time. That doesn't work. If you really want to collect meaningful information, want to create meaningful relationship that can last, it takes time. That's what I want to say.
Thank you. Donna. Donna, United for Ukraine developed quite organically, right? But its growth and impact have been significant. And how did this collaboration develop, and how do you think it has impacted on the effectiveness in terms of communication and engagement with affected Ukrainian people?
Thank you so much for this question.
You're welcome.
I think that the story of United for Ukraine is really unique. It was founded on the first day the full-out war began on February 24, and it was started by people that weren't from the humanitarian or aid sector. One of the founders works in Google. One of our other founders has a very prominent legal career, and about 60 volunteers that ran the organization were from tech, they were students, they were marketing professionals. And now I joined the organization, and I myself have a background in the private sector. I ran a book publishing company for 13 years in Ukraine. So I think this spirit, this background of everyone was really beneficial to, thinking outside the box, to wanting to collaborate with many kinds of organizations. And, via the platform, we collaborated with over 200 different companies and nonprofits. With our legal tool, we provide free legal assistance. We work with around 500 pro bono lawyers internationally. And, this spirit of really pushing the boundaries of making contacts, of thinking outside the box, I think is a value for us. And I think this creates meaningful work for us, and it helps us really create meaningful work for our audience, for the displaced people in Ukraine and outside Ukraine. And I think in addition, we are very obsessed, with marketing, with tools that we use, what kind of tool can we use to reach, our audience? Are we effective? Are we successful? How are we engaging? Is this effective? Is this successful? So these are the questions that we're asking ourselves all the time.
Thank you. This is a brilliant success story of how so many, diverse actors have come together and made it work. Louisa, I'd come to you next. You worked recently on the links between accountability and development and humanitarian planning, right? And so why do you think it is so important to continue to involve the way we collaborate around communication and community engagement?
Can you hear me? Thank you for that very easy question. I wanted to build on what Haile was talking about a little on the cultural background. And I think one of the things, I've been now independent for a couple of years, having worked most of my career in the kind of international humanitarian sector. And as an independent, I think hopefully I can be freer to say certain things. We really don't understand the cultures of participation. So on top of the cultural background, it's how do people feel comfortable participating, engaging, and that is a prerequisite for collaboration. And so it's usually on agencies' terms, right? And what Dana is describing, which is so interesting, is that it's not this traditional humanitarian model. It's people coming in with a very clear added value from the legal perspective or from the marketing perspective. And I think it's interesting also using the word marketing, because as a humanitarian, we might see marketing as a dirty word, right? Because it's about products, about selling things. We don't sell things. We're pro bono. We're supporting people. But it's actually a lot of the work that's done successfully in engaging people and collaborating and getting them to participate is understanding that cultural background and stepping away from that agency-centric perspective that we need to fill a survey or we need to, have this needs assessment done for a proposal. It's what are people telling us in which ways, and then how do they want to be involved on what? And so redefining that added value and turning that perspective, I think, is really crucial. Unfortunately, accountability has become kind of that shorthand to say that's how we're going to do that, but we run the risk of kind of ticking the box. And so it's really refreshing to be in a room full of people who are coming with very different perspectives, because I think that's what's needed in this discussion is not the navel gazing, not the agency-centric accountability, but how do you want to participate in my program? How do beneficiaries want to be involved? It's no, it's their world. We're walking into it. What can we offer? And how are we communicating that and marketing it such that we can present an added value? So flipping that narrative.
Great, thanks. Rakesh, okay. Your career has focused on technology and specific partnerships in communication and other digital responses in crisis. What do you think are the key things to consider when it comes to communication engagement, since we're talking on?
Thank you so much for having me, and I'm grateful to all my fellow panelists here for their thoughts as well. I'm really interested in the topic. Thank you for the question. I think the first thing that I start off with is a set of first principles. So throughout the journey since the year 2000, we've been on this journey now 25 years long around bringing modern technology into humanitarian crises. And a lot of my work has been bringing the private sector, people from Silicon Valley, people from the tech sector into humanitarian spaces where they may be, recognized brands, but they certainly aren't necessarily humanitarian experts. And so what I start off these conversations and these collaborations with is a set of first principles. The first one is that humanitarian action itself is principled. So this is not news to people in the room. Humanity, neutrality, independence, the Durant principles that underpin the formal humanitarian system. And I want to underline that word formal for a second. The second principle that I tell people is that data is always about people. Often computer scientists are not often well-versed in thinking about this because they think about just moving the bits. But understanding that data, even machine data and other kinds of data that could be considered abstract from humans, can ultimately be traced back to humans and human activity. And then the last of these three principles is that data is always a form of power. Again, as a computer scientist, we're not used to thinking about data as a form of power, but we know that data can be used to help, but it can also be used to harm. And so we have to come into these spaces because of the intrinsic vulnerability of people who are in humanitarian crisis. We have to come at this with a set of clear eyes. Now, this isn't necessarily the only model, the formal humanitarian system. There is this notion of humanitarian resistance, and I think Ukraine does show how this model does work, which is sort of outside of the formal Geneva-centric lens of the world, right? These are people coming together with a sense of agency to come together in these coalitions and these communities of practice around specific problems that need to be solved. We see this in the context of Ukraine right now, but we also see this in the context of many other formal organizations. So, for example, in the United States, way back in 2012, during Hurricane Sandy, there was something called Occupy Sandy, which was, again, an informal technology-driven coalition to meet needs that the formal response community simply were not able to meet or were not responsive enough to meeting. So the technology has certainly accelerated this capability in all that time, but we need to figure out a way as a community to bring together both the formal, very Geneva Conventions, very Geneva-centric way of humanitarian action, plus this kind of very local people just taking matters into their own hands and saying there's a problem to go solve, so let's go solve it. And then how do we make sure that these various communities and activities of practice are ultimately responsive to the people on the ground that they aim to serve and are accountable to them? Thanks so much.
Great. Thank you so much, Rakesh, for that insight.
So I think we've heard there a wide range of different key collaborators, and it will come as no surprise to anybody, or I'm sure no one disagrees that we need to collaborate with everyone. But what we had started, I think, to unpick there is some of the different incentives maybe for that collaboration from different stakeholders or collaborators as we're using today. So incentives for collaboration, but also incentives for being engaged. And we wanted to ask some questions now that really start to look at this future and kind of future proofing. So Rakesh, hopefully you've had a water. I'm going to come straight back to you. You talked about partnerships there with private sector and the differences between maybe some of the principles that we've hold ourselves to. But what do you think is what do you see as the future in terms of some of the partnerships that you've outlined there, some of the collaboration? What do we need to be aware of in the sector, and how can we better collaborate more? How can we collaborate more effectively?
Thanks so much. So the humanitarian system is very well versed in working with non-governmental actors as well as states, armed groups, and other sort of the people we would expect to run into in a humanitarian crisis. The one factor that I think has to be taken into account with regards to technology is that unlike states, tech companies basically own most of the digital infrastructure, right? So Facebook, Google, Apple, Microsoft, and so on. These are not states, but arguably they have similar power in many political and economic ways to states. And so we do need a much more mature lens about acting in concert with these very powerful entities that don't have any, if you can go through all the Geneva Conventions, you can go through the Sphere Handbook, there is no mention of the private sector whatsoever. And yet the private sector has huge influence on our digital lives and therefore our digital responses to humanitarian crises. So we need a much more mature conversation there. For example, in the United States, anybody can go online and take formal emergency management training and get certifications for free. It basically gives you a basic working vocabulary about how emergency responses work in a United States context. But going to the international context, there is no similar online training, for example, for the United Nations cluster system, for the interaction between the United Nations entities, as well as the NGO partners, as well as how they actually interact on the ground in a real world humanitarian crisis. So for an organization, let's just say Google or Apple, for an organization like Google or Apple to come into a humanitarian crisis, the people in these companies really do want to help. I work with them all the time. They're very well intentioned, but from their perspective coming into this world, it's very complicated and there is no path to getting smart quickly, right? So bootstrapping partners and helping them be good partners for the mission here of these organizations in the room is a missing capability. And so one thing that I would say that perhaps CDAC and its partners could help with is to create the kind of training, the kind of knowledge base that an outside partner who just needs to get smart about this world very quickly, help them come into the space and be well-intentioned and be engaged at a smarter level, right? My experience is that when you have a private sector partner who really does understand the system, you have a much richer conversation and a much deeper collaboration.
Great, and some very clear recommendations already. So thanks for that, Rakesh. And I think interesting to look at how we can sort of make some of these collaborations more feasible. Dana, coming to you next. United for Ukraine has an interesting story of how it's evolved, and you outlined it there. And in some ways, the collaboration begins to consider some of what Rakesh outlined. Is this a glimpse into the future, do you think? And how easy would something like this be to replicate? So how easily could we replicate this if we wanted to in the future?
I definitely agree that there needs to be a more mature conversation about the private sector To me, collaboration with the private sector and media just comes naturally after living in Ukraine for 13 years, because when you work in a country like Ukraine, you collaborate with different stakeholders. You're open to collaborating with business, so it's just part of your DNA. And after the Euromaidan, just to have a little history flashback, people are really open in Ukraine to coming together from different communities just to get, an issue sorted. When we speak about United for Ukraine, our platform, emergency relief platform, is a large success due to the support of Google and IRC, and the collaboration was, it was outstanding. It was great to come together with having professionals from Google and professionals from our team and IRC to have this really gigantic project, learn from each other, share information, really think outside the box. It's a unique experience, and I think this is what the future ought to look like, because it's great, it's fun, and it really creates something that is meaningful, and it works for the people we need to assist.
Thanks, Dana. And I think, Haile, coming to you, just to build on some of the things that Dana has said then. I mean, people affected in a crisis, whether refugees or in the country of a crisis, represent a full cross-section of society. Yet it seems that when it comes to collaboration with humanitarian action, they become maybe a single stakeholder. Do you think this is do you agree? I guess was the first point. And do you think this is something that might be holding back collaboration? Are we missing opportunities?
If I may, I want to speak about my experience working the job integration of refugees. And I was working in a small association which understood the role of private sector involvement in making that sure. Because, the state, the government invests a lot of money in so-called job integration programs. It's so expensive and a lot of money being invested for that, but you have very low success rate. But as an association, they found out, okay, without the private sector, who are the job givers, we can forget about this. And so my colleagues went out and did interviews with 50 private companies to find out why are they not hiring refugees. So, but the learning is interesting. One of the things said, they put refugees in the same basket and call them, we don't know them. I'm not sure if they would fit with my team. So why should I go through this pain of integrating someone from far away that I don't know the culture to the team when I have the option of hiring someone from the locality? So what this association that I worked for did was, okay, don't worry about that. We're going to prepare them to understand the Swiss culture, the Swiss work culture. And we will also make sure that they have some kind of practical experience, how it is like the job place. And they start opening up. I think this was the best way to communicate with the parents. They start being open to try. So that's what happened, and many of them reacted positively after that. They gave us the opportunity for 3 months of internship, and then some of it translated to permanent. So it's kind of the narration behind, what is a refugee, like you're some kind of alien coming from the same kind of, rather than being so diverse and in terms of demography, culture, religion, what have you. So it doesn't take that reality into consideration. And I think that might be one of the challenges. And I would suggest that we should deliberately work on, communicating clearly what refugees are. I think the case of Ukrainian refugees is different because you can kind of guess who they are and they look like you, and and somehow you have this image of being same group, same kind of people. But when it comes to refugees, we're diverse. We're all over the continent, the world. So needs some work.
All right, I'm going to ask you a follow-up question if that's okay. When it comes to communication and engagement, just with, I guess, maybe your last point in mind, how come there be a better balance between facilitating communication and engagement and kind of extracting information?
So I think when you are there with the right intention and you can show that they're willing to collaborate, that's what they did with my experience. It took trust building, but they're not in principle against collaborating. It just takes their style and understanding what they went through, and also takes a lot of listening their needs, sitting with them. This was the challenge. Like being from a humanitarian organization, having fixed plans to achieve some kind of goal doesn't give you the flexibility. Okay, I'm going to spend 2 hours with this refugee-led organization leader to understand what their concerns, challenges are, and build cultivate some kind of connection that can last, because you would need them in the future. So I think that's the playground, I would say. Yeah.
Great, thanks. Sorry, Haile, I think 3 questions I gave you in a row about that. Louisa, you've been working, as you outlined, more recently on some of the links between humanitarian action and what is done around social accountability and social protection. Do you think that, I'm going to say we, as humanitarian actors, do you think we often forget that dialogue happens anyway, that it happens within programs? What do you think? How do you think we sort of go beyond rhetoric, and who should we be learning from? Is anyone doing this right?
That's a really good question. I think the difficulty is this me? Oh. I think the difficulty that we have in general is that a lot of the good practice tends to be anecdotal. It tends to be very contextual. And then that makes it very difficult to say, for example, would we get the same level of political and financial interest as there has been, for example, in Ukraine, Somalia right now? Probably not. So I think when it comes to who should be involved, I did want to take a point that was made by both Haile and Rakesh around this idea of private sector versus civil society. The private sector simply means any actor that's essentially for profit, right? So there's a different private sector if we're talking about media, if we're talking about businesses that can employ refugees, versus those of us who have been in the cash space looking at financial service providers. So I think it's really important that plurality of perspectives doesn't only come from affected communities. We tend to be pretty myopic as humanitarians to look at who are the most vulnerable, the most in need, because we have no time, we have limited resources. But taking a step back and having worked now a bit on the social protection side of things and the development actors who sometimes get it right, like us, and sometimes also maybe miss the mark. There's a longer time frame, and there's a little bit more of an in-depth analysis of what are those plurality of perspectives. So when we talk about a refugee, as Haile was saying, everyone thinks of someone who is, poor, maybe huddling, shivering, with a lot of children coming into a country looking and needing help. But actually that person, and hopefully we're getting away from that narrative, that is an independent and economic actor in his or her own right. They have a network that they're relying on, whether it's for information or for assistance or support. And then how do we tap into those networks and make sure we're really listening and not just recording? I think it's something that on the social accountability side, to be frank, it's been a bit easier because they're looking at longer time frames and the stakeholders are different. And I don't want to open a whole nother Pandora's box, but there's something to be said about the social accountability being framed in the kind of citizens' rights. And even though refugees, for example, may not be technically citizens, there's a lot more work on the social accountability side to say, okay, how do we integrate, how do we include people and collaborate with different groups in a particular context over a longer period of time where that trust can come in? How do we understand those different relationships? So for example, civil society from a humanitarian perspective, we like that as a term of, it's basically what a synonym for local actors, and it makes us feel good because it's, you know, they're really not for profit, very socially minded, it's great. Civil society can include everything from the far right to the far left. And we need to remember that. As a Greek, I remember going into the refugee and migrant response in Greece and having to remind a lot of colleagues that civil society, I mean, do we want to meet with Golden Dawn? Those of you who know who the far right, you know, it's a political party, but they've got so many different civil society actors who are doing their work. So again, it's unpacking that. And I think for better, for worse, on the social accountability side, there's a thinking around, okay, who are the different actors, and I will call them stakeholders, the collaborators, the participants in the system, and then are they passive or are they more active citizens? And I think there's something for us to learn on that. At the same time, of course, the luxury of time to build those relationships. I think we have a lot of work to be done on whether you call them frontline staff or field staff, the people who interact with people, I would say communities affected by crisis, but I mean the whole gamut, right? From the leaders to everyone involved. How then are we engaging with them, and how do we understand the networks that they navigate, and how do we do that relatively quickly when there's not enough time and money to?
Thanks, Louisa, and thanks, everyone. I think just going to hand over to Palwashay, but just really starting to look at at the wider landscape, and so obviously that's very relevant for us as CDAC because we have a lot of those analyses. So how can we lift that, and how can we make sure that we're really utilising what we collect? So something to think about.
Thanks. And I think no matter how much we evolve and no matter how much we talk about, you know, media and innovation and creativity, I don't think we can ever, overestimate the power of listening. And we can't ever, substitute direct communication and engagement. And I've seen that in the floods in Pakistan just recently, how personal and direct communication with the communities would change, our perspective, who are, I mean, I'm local and I work there, and I understood things so differently just by being there and being with them at that point and being in their spaces, being in their homes and trying to understand what they're going through. So I think there is no substitute for that. And looking at the coming decade, I think we now need to kind of identify who our key actors are, particularly who our most important collaborators are. If we want to achieve our focus on shifting decision-making. So I'll come to you first, Dana. We've heard about how your work has demonstrated how quickly a network of known local actors can get together with quick funding from a diverse group of funders. How important is it for United for Ukraine to link with UN-led bodies and NGO groups? Do you think this is going to be easy?
I think that there's harder things in life, definitely. I think that it is important for us to link with and partner with large humanitarian organizations. This is what we're doing now. It's really interesting for us to make these friendships and to show our work and what we can contribute. But it's also very important for us to link with, the little guy in Ukraine. And there are so many small, just really fantastic, innovative, small humanitarian organizations, nonprofits that have sprung up since the full-fledged war began, that I think that would be great benefit for us to link somehow, what's happening in the realm of large humanitarian organizations and what's happening with, the smaller ones on the ground. Because now, being at this event, and living in Europe right now, I understand there's a huge kind of, I mean, the world between them and here is miles apart. So it would be great to foster that collaboration. And now I'm thinking that is a big priority for us. And I think that this would be a great priority for, serious humanitarian players to collaborate and to listen to what, they have to say, what kind of solutions they have.
Right. Thank you. Rakesh, you mentioned tech companies are ready to get involved and the humanitarian system can really use their expertise. But how can we build the trust required to collaborate on an area like community engagement? As you know, the perception of many humanitarian workers is that private tech companies have had a mixed impact at best. And there are serious digital security concerns. So what do you have to say about that?
Thanks so much. Yes, this is very true. What I would say is that there is a history of technology companies working successfully with humanitarians. The first generation of digital humanitarian response, I would say, came together around the 2010 Haiti earthquake. And during that time, there was a coalition of groups and individuals from the private sector on the tech side, as well as individuals from the United Nations, the formal humanitarian organizations, and even certain government from various governments came together in a Skype room to solve problems. And so a lot of the trust relationships that were built during the Haiti earthquake carried this community forward for about 4 or 5 years until people kind of went off into new jobs, new roles, new organizations, and those trust relationships and that sort of tribal knowledge broke down. So what I would say is that this kind of informal trust coalition did exist at one point around the Haiti earthquake, and it did service all the way through, say, the 2015 Nepal earthquake, but it currently does not really exist in a formal way today. And part of this is because there are many new actors in the space who weren't around in 2010, and then obviously we didn't ever really formally codify what that was. You mentioned data security and privacy, right? So these are huge concerns, and everyone has every right to be concerned about them. The idea of data collection and the concerns about extractive data collection when you're dealing with vulnerable populations is very real. And as the Ukraine conflict or even other conflicts such as Syria or in Ethiopia between Ethiopia and Tigray have shown, the digital space becomes a battle space as well. And we've seen this on all sides of any modern conflict. And so humanitarians are not immune from this phenomenon. 6 or 7 years ago, I was in a humanitarian conference in Europe, and I was told very confidently that no one would ever attack us because we're humanitarians from a digital perspective. And that seemed blindingly naive to me then. But as we understand, humanitarians are one of the top 4 most targeted organizations or categories of organizations targeted by state actors, according to Microsoft. So we know that the organizations will come under attack. And how do we actually bring in the right kind of data protection? So what I would say is that, yes, there is a lot of work to be done with building these relationships with the private sector. As I said earlier, educating them. But we're now in this phase where, the first part of this journey was just getting the internet into an emergency. I would say that this was basically from 2000 to 2014, this idea that, hey, how do we just get internet into an emergency and what can we do with it once we have it? The second generation was about connecting with communities. How do we provide connectivity not just for the response community, but also for the affected population themselves, right? This idea of communications as a form of aid itself. We've demonstrated that on things like the Syrian refugee crisis in Europe and in other emergencies recently, that we can provide connectivity to affected people at scale because many people now have smartphones where that wasn't always true in the past. So now we're in this third phase, and this was driven primarily by the COVID-19 pandemic, but I think it's also going to be driven largely by climate change, which is data for impact. Now that we actually can get bits into and out of the emergency, how do we ensure that they carry meaning? How do we ensure that they are protective bits that actually mitigate harms rather than introduce harms? This is the work of our community right now, and I think that it takes a huge coalition of both the formal humanitarian community, the various tech experts, both inside and outside of the community, and then the last set of actors that I would talk about is just the most local actors. These tend to be the ad hoc or informal communities of practice, the local organizations who you will never see on the international news, who actually do the lion's share of the work. And I would say that our participation as a CDAC community with these organizations is constrained by the fact that the financing doesn't go there right now. The Grand Bargain said that by 2020, a quarter of the money will be going to local organizations, but in 2021, that real number was 1.2%. So there's still structural challenges that we are fighting against in order to make this participation revolution actually a reality.
Right. Thank you. Thank you, Rakesh. There's that. And there's also contextual realities and how they differ for each region, each country that we need to consider. And I see that we really need to advocate on this as a network and as separate individual members and how to make this effective with key collaborators. Haile, so refugees now have better and more collective tools to organize and work together within and across borders. They share information on these networks to fill the gaps in information or to work out privately on what's going on to resolve their issues, to address their concerns. What could they do better to connect with humanitarian coordination? And should they even connect at all? Given that humanitarian systems often take over and they tend to be bureaucratic at times.
Maybe if I may, want to take you back to what I started earlier. I think what is important when it comes to communities is first step, and recognition capacity. Just to be recognized, you have to have the capacity to do that. It's like chicken and egg problem. So recognition comes before collaboration. You have to be, recognized. People, organizations should know you exist. So one of the finding was that this organization, although they do a lot of stuff with minimal resources to support their community members, sometimes nobody knows them. They exist. So I think, like Rakesh said, communication as a form of aid, I think helping them getting recognized as a form of aid will be a good step forward of connecting them to humanitarian organizations. I don't think they have the capacity, forge some kind of collaboration. Different organizations, stakeholders. That's why their activities are limited to just day-to-day support of their members. And maybe this mindset, I'm talking about the whole system of fixing problems, fighting with the system, considering refugees as victims rather than part of the system or playing key roles. System, this is the shift we need. And I am observing, I'm witnessing that going on, maybe not to the desired level, but that's why we are here, I think. And the organization I work in, UNHCR, uses its leverage on work of refugee-led organizations so that they get visibility and collaboration, from the private to government sectors. I'm not sure if I'm answering directly the question, but what I am suggesting is first recognize they exist and they're contributing and build their capacity that they gain more recognition. Then we can talk about collaboration. But it doesn't mean they're that there are no good examples. There are. I wanted to share one success story. One of the organizations that I mapped have done a fantastic job with very, very limited resource. So this is association, an organization in Zurich, Arabic speaking. Most of the members are refugees. 2019 to 2020, they managed to teach 800 children speak Arabic and to write Arabic. And they implement 40 integration programs. They collaborate 9 different institutions. So I was asking them, it's women-led, women-only organization. I was asking, how did you manage to do that? They struggle to this day getting finance to rent rooms for their classes. So it's volunteer-based, completely volunteer-based. They managed to stay last 20 years. Every year is a fight to survive. No, I was asking them, what helped so that you sustained? The answer was interesting to me. The founder, she told me, because we are women, you know, the women's resilience challenge. I think they are willing to collaborate. They have the capacity to, and the capacities refugee, other disaster-affected communities.
Yeah, we're a force of nature. So that sort of commitment, I think, is rare. But yeah, so that's definitely a good success story for others to learn for. But in terms of collaborations, I see that you recommend that first we recognize them as key collaborators as a first step before we actually start the collaboration process, which makes sense. Louisa, you've looked at the possible allies that we need going forward, but in a world where information influence are a battleground, and Rakesh also mentioned that, is collaboration even possible?
I mean, it's already happening, so we kind of have to embrace it. And so I think this isn't like a plugged sponsorship, but shout out to IFSC for all the work they've been doing on the rumor tracking. And I really do encourage those of you who are maybe less familiar with that, the tools and the resources that they have available for that other organizations that I've worked with, whether it's from an international donor to a very localized responder, there's a lot of really good stuff there. And I think this idea of rumor tracking and being able to empower different actors to understand the difference between, let's say, reinforcing or positive networks and messages and collaborations versus those that may not be in their best interests. I don't think it's a question. It always makes me cringe when we talk about capacity building. We're going to train people. It's really about the exchanges, because we tend, and I say we as the humanitarians tend to think that we're living in a vacuum, right? That we can control the narrative. That collaboration is happening whether we like it or not. Who needs to be involved? I think your question, Haile, about the success of these women in Zurich, the crux of it is the scale, right? When we talk about their achievements, they're incredible over this 20-year period. We're now looking at displacement and need at the scale of, tens of millions, hundreds of millions of people. And so a lot of people in this room, probably online, and your bosses are worried about how are we going to support 1.5 million people on the whatever it might be. And then we tend to get lost then in thinking we need to collaborate. It's at scale. We need to do it. We need to do it ourselves. We need to do it yesterday. And I think if we just take a quick step and have a look again at that, the understanding of, like you were saying, we can't get away from not listening. Whether it's digital listening, because we're collecting a lot of information that we're not listening to. There's a difference between recording it and collecting it and actually sitting down and engaging with what people are saying. So looking at how can we tackle the issue of collaborating at scale, that doesn't mean that we can do everything for everyone. That might sound a bit pessimistic, but we've kind of gotten away from this idea. We were talking with one of the colleagues from Kenya about how that whole conversation, the whole trust, we tend to think of collaboration as needing to be measured in, success and key performance metrics and who's doing what, and look at all of our, amazing achievements. There's a lot that's impossible in the work that we do. That doesn't mean that the collaboration shouldn't happen. It is happening. But how can we have these realistic conversations and bring people in so that, it's more of a networked approach? I mean, CDAC is a network, right?
Yeah.
How do we ensure that we've got the right people around the table to tackle the piece they're best placed to do, instead of trying to, take a step back and promise these lofty things? And that's where I think the collaboration is happening. So how do we essentially ensure that we are supporting the collaboration that reinforces people's different perspectives and capacities and reinforces the principles that we're...
Thank you. So we take baby steps, but we start with something, right? Yeah, that's...
Great, thank you. And I'm told that there's a very lively chat going on that on Slido. For some reason I can't find it, but maybe we're excluded. Maybe we're all talking about us up the front here. But do follow along, because everyone is chatting, so please make sure you join in. We're a few minutes ahead of our schedule, so we're going to take this opportunity to throw in some questions that have come in from Slido. Louisa, first one to you from Jen Doherty at ALNAP. With closing space, what factors should humanitarians consider when adapting social accountability approaches in contexts where speaking out is risky?
Ooh, that's a good one. If I had that answer, I feel like we'd be up for a Nobel Prize, right? But let's try. Again, I'm going to go back to those cultures of participation. There's a lot of tools that the social accountability space and world uses around, whether it's called the participation spectrum, sometimes they call it the participation ladder, which I don't, frankly, when we start placing value, then we're actually going back to the same thing, which is prescribing, dictating to people in crisis how they should be feeling or participating. So again, looking at that culture of participation and the ways in which people feel comfortable engaging, having those conversations with people who really understand what are the different perspectives within our community, the same way we try to unpack civil society or private sector, and then being able to understand, again, going back to that idea of networks, we tend to focus on what we can measure and what we can map and what we can put in a log frame or in a PDF, post-distribution monitoring or whatever it might be. But a lot of that trust and the good ideas come from the informal engagement, Palwashay, you're talking about sitting with people in their homes and really understanding their perspectives. So trying to get around maybe what might be a direct engagement with communities that don't feel comfortable speaking out or literally cannot speak out. What could be the different ways in which to leverage those networks that are supporting them in a positive way, and then basically, what do we call it? The spaghetti method, where you throw a bunch of spaghetti and see what sticks. I think there's been a lot of success stories of different responses that we're not sure how to engage or what communication methods to use. And I'm sure Dana has some great examples from those more communication or market-oriented partners of the different channels that you use or the messages that you use, and then taking stock and seeing how that can happen. So again, indirect doesn't necessarily mean less effective in these contexts. And I also think one of the other things which, unfortunately, as humanitarian responses don't tend to think on longer term perspectives, with the hindsight of being able to look into what worked and what didn't at different points in time, you can actually also sometimes see an evolution. So now, for example, there's a lot of acute crises happening in Lebanon, but there's a really rich history of protest, of engagement of different groups on behalf of other groups that are not feeling comfortable to speak out, that I think that we shouldn't ignore just because we're trying to focus on those vulnerable.
Thanks very much. And Dana, there's one for you here from Pfizer at WFP. Do you think large humanitarian organizations give enough space to local actors to identify real needs, or have they formed projects looking for local partners to implement? So are the projects already formed?
Thank you for the question. I think it's a great question. I have experience with living in Ukraine and seeing what that feels like as a Ukrainian actor, and what the feeling is amongst Ukrainian actors. I think I think the answer that the large humanitarian organizations aren't giving enough space for these actors. I think that there's definitely room for improvement, and I'm very excited to see this happening. And I think this ought to happen because yet again, even in terms of what's happening in Ukraine, this is what I understand, that the work that's done by the large humanitarian organizations and what the local smaller actors, there's no contact, there seems to be no collaboration. So at least it would be great to start this collaboration, this conversation happening, and then go forward of how these actors, local actors, can be supported by expertise yet again, as opposed to given a framework or a set of ideas that they should in this kind of colonial way just kind of take on and use.
Thanks, Dana. Maybe one more from our group, but we'll continue to submit them and we'll put them forward. We have from Johnny to Rakesh. How do you address the apparent contradiction between spending time to understand people and fast-growing private sector supported self-evaluating engagement?
Yeah, that's a great question. So on the private sector side, there is a trend towards more what's called ESG response. So environment, sustainability, social impact, and governance, right? So ESG is basically a investor framework that a lot of private sector companies are now being responsive to, primarily around things like climate change and other impacts of this sort. So I think part of this conversation, or part of this answer, is to understand what everyone's coming to the table with from a motivation standpoint. So private sector companies typically want to show up, and these companies often have to dance on the head of a pin. In other words, on the one hand, because of their shareholders, because of their employees, because of their other stakeholders, they want to be seen as being responsive to a crisis. So we saw this with COVID, we're seeing this now with Ukraine. But interestingly enough, there's 45 active conflicts in the world today. And Ukraine has taken certainly the bulk of the attention this year, leaving many of these other conflicts not even on the radar of many of these private sector organizations. So on the one hand, these companies want to be seen as being responsive to whatever the crisis of the moment is. But on the other hand, they cannot be seen as being exploitative, right? People will react negatively if they are being seen as acting in an inauthentic way. And so for those people who are in the private sector, who are trying to show up in these kind of contexts, they kind of have to make they have to dance on the head of a compromise here between these two competing interests. If we recognize that, we can say, okay, now that we understand what your motivations are of being in the room, what can we do together? And I think that it requires a more mature conversation around what does collaboration, what does partnership look like? We do toss these terms around often very loosely, without a lot of rigor or without a lot of structure. Just like the word dialogue. So I think that what we need to do is we need to actually root these conversations in impact. The notion of what does each side in the conversation hope to take away from it, and then how do we craft the work to enable the majority of these key things to actually occur, so that both the served community feels like they've gotten what they need, the support that they need, the humanitarian organization gets what they need, the various private sector actors get what they need, and to do it in a way that is fundamentally not extractive and is absolutely respective of the humanitarian context in which this takes place in. And what I would say is that there's a lot of work needed specifically to build local and national capacities to manage this kind of data inflow, these kind of collaborations. We typically think about humanitarian action in a single model that kind of comes from ICRC and the international system that we know today. But I would put to you that there's also this notion of humanitarian resistance, right? So you see this right now in many organizations, many local ad hoc organizations that are not at all neutral per se. They are actively taking a side in a conflict or a crisis, but they're providing humanitarian aid. And I think that we don't have any way to have a conversation with these kind of organizations from a sort of a doctrine standpoint. You see this. So when I was in Eastern Europe just a few months ago in Moldova and Poland, I saw a lot of individual people from around the world who flew in to drive people out of Lviv and Kyiv and other places in Ukraine. They're ad hoc. They're not formal. They're very partisan, but are they actually humanitarians? I would say yes, but they're not the kind of humanitarians that would have a Red Cross logo on their vehicle, right? So we have to have a much more nuanced lens as to what humanitarian action actually means. And it can't be rooted solely in documents that are 75 to 150 years old.
Thanks, Rakesh. Thanks for that. In about 15 minutes, we're going to move to our decision rooms where you will be in the driving seat and how to change the sector, and it will go through. Before we go into our decision rooms, we're going to flash another Slido code at you, and this is for, and we want to ask you, what are the most stubborn barriers to actually getting better at collaboration? So if you could just put in one or two words, we all know how these clouds work now, and just to really hear from you on the barriers, what you think are going to be the biggest barriers to better collaboration. So as people we are, I'm assured, going to see the cloud on our screens once you've had time to copy down the link. So maybe we're going to come back to the panel. Haile, I'm going to come back to you first, if that's okay, and just ask you, what do you think are the main barriers, or some of the big barriers? I think there's a few. So what do you think what come to mind?
I think the approach, like I mentioned that previously, this approach of fixing the problem, fighting the civil, that has to change. And we need to engage as humans, not as a victim and helper. So one of the learnings from the mapping, much potential lies within the communities, and the intrinsic motivation to contribute to their members and to the community, the host community they live in. And I think this is important when it comes to talking about barriers. It is the mindset, like about refugees or affected people. So there is a good example with the Ukrainian crisis. See people reacting as humans. That was heartwarming for me individually. Can collaborate and support others in need. So that shows you there is a potential to do that. Just we didn't know yet how to access it. And now we have an example to show. That's what I want to say.
I think we're going to see the word cloud up soon, but Louisa, maybe just coming to you next, as you're next to Haile. What do you, if you were to answer this question, what do you think are the biggest barriers for us in better collaboration on communication and engagement?
I think the biggest barrier is just this humanitarian fishbowl, right? That we continue to be in, and to be agency-centric when it comes to collaborating and trying to think outside of that box. So all these incredible initiatives are happening. We've been aware of the issues for a long time. Those of you in the room who have been working on accountability to affected populations, this idea that a complaints and feedback mechanism, a hotline, a complaint box is enough to be accountable. We've known this for decades now, and yet we're still focusing a lot on internal processes, project-based, that kind of thing. And so I think we are our own biggest barrier, and there's a risk of not listening and continuing to be tokenistic when it comes to being people-centered and to collaborating outside the box. But I would say that that's also one of the biggest opportunities, is that if we're not, and no offense to fish, but if we're not out of this fishbowl, then we'll be left behind. Then we will remain in that fishbowl, and everybody else will be swimming out to sea. And so I think that is also just an opportunity for us to take a reality check and to think a bit, as Dana was saying, outside the box with some different actors. And hopefully that's something that we can start to tackle with this smart group of people.
Thanks, Louisa. We can see now up behind us and in front of you, if you're participating, that a very diverse word cloud, but that racism has come up very strong, neo-colonialism. Maybe I'm going to come to Dana next. Is there anything on there that you wholeheartedly support, or whether it's something that surprises you?
Oh, unfortunately, I support a lot of things, and it's I think some things like neo-colonialism, power unbalanced. It's an unwillingness to give up power to the other actors, inherent racism that is present, and it's just it's very deep rooted, and it's definitely a barrier. So there's a lot of it's a lot of very, very complex, very serious topics that might take a lot of time to tackle. But I think just realizing that these are barriers is a start. So if we start here and say that these are issues, this is already a beginning, and this can create a great space for discussion and inclusiveness for other actors. And I think this is important to do, and this is where the world is going, and this is the future of tackling these barriers.
Interesting. I'm a bit surprised to see that lack of infrastructure hasn't come in as a barrier, because from where I come, that's one of the main barriers. And Rakesh, maybe you can add to that, since you come from the tech side. I mean, if there is no infrastructure, in a lot of places like Afghanistan and Pakistan, that's the only example I can give from my own experience. There are no such things as roads, there are no telecommunication lines. So for us, that's one of the biggest barriers to communication and coordination, especially, and to community engagement. How do you just to reach these communities, just to make them secure and safe from a disaster, from a hazard? I mean, that's a priority at that time. So lack of infrastructure has always been one of the biggest barriers, and I'm surprised to see that hasn't come up.
So I would say that reflects one of the bias of us in this conversation right now, in that I think all of us are very connected. I'm sitting to you outside of Seattle right now, thousands of kilometers away from Geneva. We're talking, so infrastructure for those of us in the room and those of us on the teams here, I think that's kind of a given. And so I think that kind of reflects sort of an implicit bias in who's participating today. Because I do agree with you that in many hard to reach contexts, infrastructure still is a barrier. What I would say, though, is that we've demonstrated that we know how to do this. In other words, just from a connectivity and technology infrastructure, right? Nothing works without power. Nothing works without connectivity out to the rest of the world. We know how to do this, though. The reason why it doesn't exist is less about the technical realities and more about political and economic will, I think. In other words, those places in Afghanistan and in Pakistan that still struggle to remain connected or remain, outside of basic infrastructure, we know how to build roads. We know how to build telecommunications. We know how to get telecommunications into very hard to reach areas. It's less about that technical question and more about the will and the economics of doing so, which I think is a very important gating factor. One thing that I want to come back to on the word cloud, however, is this notion of racism. And we've even seen this with regards to Ukraine recently. So as people were coming over into Eastern Europe earlier this year and still continue to come over in dribs and drabs, what I noticed was that there was a very different kind of response in Europe to this flow of refugees versus the last major flow of refugees, which I saw, which was in 2015 around the Syrians and Afghans. It's very, very different. There's a lot more goodwill in this case, but that goodwill was certainly not universal. So, for example, if you were a Roma Ukrainian coming over into Europe at the beginning of the war a few months ago, you got a very different response out of the international and local aid communities because the Roma happen to be one of the last people in Europe that it's okay to discriminate against, right? And this is both true inside of Ukraine and other parts of Eastern Europe, as well as the destination countries elsewhere in Europe. And so when I spoke to UNHCR about this challenge, because what I was seeing was that there was a very unequal access to technology between the Roma population or the Indian or African population that was coming out of Ukraine versus the majority of Ukrainians. I was told in March of this year that they agreed that there was absolutely an unequal response, but because there wasn't enough resources, they would have to come back to this notion of equity later. And this struck me as interesting because there is no such thing as retroactive equality or equity in a crisis, right? That doesn't exist. And so I do think that we need to build equity as one of the foundational values into all of our collaborations and our interactions at the earliest moments of a crisis response, not just, when we have the breathing room to address it. So I do think that some of this is absolutely structural. But I want to say yes, and these human factors of implicit bias or explicit bias do factor into who even gets the infrastructure, who is worthy of protection, and why. So I think these are very complicated things that we need to continue the dialogue on, and we need to involve the stakeholders, especially from these local communities. But of course, that's easy to say. Getting communities that have a mistrust of those of us in the room here to actually talk with us in the room is another conversation entirely.
Thanks to everybody for taking part in the word cloud, and important reflections there from the panel, and a reminder, I suppose, of the bias in the room, and probably like much of the issues around infrastructure and looking at the channels of how we communicate. For many of us, it's core business, but it also just a reminder to us all that we need to keep that in our minds as we come on to the decision rooms.
We had a lot of discussion about what was wrong. It was difficult to come up with a suggestion of how to make it work. And so the theme of listening to each other, or listening to people who are very different from ourselves, kept coming back. And the idea of being face-to-face with other people was really important. So it's quite good that we're in this post-COVID, post-COVID world. But so the suggestion was face-to-face meetings at program design stage. So this was the big thing. Was, implementers are being told, this is what you need to do, and all the decisions have already been made. And collaboration means finding a good implementer and getting them to do the decisions that you've already made. So get face-to-face meetings at program design stage, including donors and people who will implement, because donors are often missing as well, and community members, not just the implementers, but community members. And the meeting should be focused on listening to each other.
Go on. Get a little bit of a sense how it went in your group once, but you were all there. So anyone?
Honestly, we didn't discuss who would be a rapporteur, but yeah, I will take my liberty on covering the discussion session, not the insights. The insights will be on the screen. So we actually had a hot discussion going on around different topics, around gatekeeping, around what does it mean to be a humanitarian actor, and who is a humanitarian actor at different levels. What are communities, and what do we mean when we are talking about community, right? How we see the community and the refugees within countries' context, within the state context, within the host countries' context, and within the countries of origin. So we definitely had a huge discussion on multiple level, and I think we covered it pretty extensive. So unlike our colleague that who reported right now that you were focusing on most things that were wrong, we came up with plenty of ways how to solve those problems, honestly. But yeah, kind of, we brainstormed a lot, but yeah, we will see what comes out on the screen. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I will go to the rear of the room. Who was the rapporteur in the rear, or who would volunteer?
Didn't really have a rapporteur, but I think one of the things we were looking at in terms of the groups who we could engage better was, dare I say it in this forum, but was looking at the media and how that could be, and how we can better use and engage with them. And then the other way of, the other question about the ways we could do things differently was looking at more kind of area-based, want of a better word that's not coordination, but how we would, go much more down to the locality. I think those were our two main points.
Thanks a lot. I think if we're through the room, I don't know, online, otherwise I hand the floor back to Rosie.
I think there's one more group. So if there's anything that was in the room, nope. If there's anything burning that you'd like.
Boy, counting.
Make it good, Richard.
We thought we got away with it. Oh. We talked a lot about tech. We talked about issues around the culture of humanitarian organizations versus the culture of tech organizations, the speed at which we work, the lack of understanding about how each other functions. We talked about whether there were ways that the system that we inhabit needs to be adapted in order to allow tech operators to come into that system. We talked a lot about our own legal and reputational worries around engaging with the tech sector. And then we had some ideas about how to fix that, but that's maybe later.
Rakesh, we are going to come to you for an official review of the decisions that have been made. Go ahead. Also, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to say that we do absolutely have to think about protecting the reputation of humanitarian organizations and their missions as they work with these brands, and in deep dialogue with that. And I just wanted to cite one example of where this could be a challenge. The WFP Palantir deal in 2020 was something that really did call a lot of things into question. And so I think that we have seen some real world challenges around some of these collaboration. So as long as we're all going into these conversations with very clear eyes, we can negotiate and figure out ways forward. But I just want to echo the last comment that it really does happen in the real world.
Thanks, Rakesh. Sorry, I wondered if someone that's come on video, but I think there are no other hands ups. So you can see there, hopefully you can all read the solutions, that the tangible next steps that people have come up with. I am going to come to Louisa. Sorry, I should first say that Dana has had to leave, and there's no emergency. She just had to do the school run, but we're really grateful to her for joining us anyway. So Louisa, what do you think about some of these? Do you think, have we been ambitious enough? Which is your favorite? Any other comments?
So the one on the bottom talks about stopping to be in capital cities and disconnect the global, national, and break the cycle of the Geneva, London kind of meetings. But I did think it was interesting in the spirit of COP27 and this whole hubbub about how many flights there are and all that, how we can do that in a responsible way. Maybe there's a digital solution. I did see there was a point on more meaningful participation, but we see that a lot in documents. And so I would just urge people to really define what that means and to make sure it's not defined on our terms. But the one that I really liked is creating those spaces where different actors can come in, and it's not about selecting or pre-selecting people. And I think it speaks to your point about the contracting not really being opening to listening. And increasingly what I'm seeing across a range of actors and what I'm really encouraging donors to do is to build in that inception period. So stop asking for needs assessments. That's again our language, the MSNA or PDM or whatever it is, but create that space and don't gatekeep, don't block people or organizations that don't have the funds to go out and to do those assessments so that they can write a beautiful proposal. Build that into your process and build the listening into the process. And the last thing I'll say is there was another one around the face-to-face meetings at program design stage. This idea, particularly around listening, so communicating and being more accountable. Unfortunately, in the recent years, we've seen a lot equated to like basically the activities are considered enough to be responsible, right? You're running a hotline, you're going to go out and do some consultations as part of the needs assessment. But actually, the people who are interacting with the community are not even the decision makers of the usual suspects. So how are we going to even open up that space? I think is crucial. So yeah, I think going back to face-to-face, if it's safe, and then thinking about the different ways that we can create those spaces. What do they look like, and how do people want those spaces to be organized?
Thanks, Louisa. Thank you. And I think I would, if I might add a reflection, I think they're a bit comfortable. I think we could go probably a bit further, and perhaps that sort of reflects probably more likely the time that we ended up giving you to put it in. But it could, if you wanted to reflect probably our comfort zone, perhaps what we think we could feasibly do about it. But I think there could be space for us to perhaps that is about bringing different people into the room so that they can suggest things that they can do about it. But I think it's Haile, what have you got any reflections on some of these?
Lisa has already said it, but maybe what I can add with creating this space is, I think I was sharing my experience, sensing journey. Before doing that, I think, this is a concept from the social lab. We need to also go pick to the stakeholder one by one and go without any preconceived opinion, only to trying to understand problem from their perspective. Once we understand, then we create this safe space. All players come. And one of the challenge I know so far is who is investing on this. Most of our mindset is result oriented. You don't know what kind of results you're going to get when you bring stakeholders together as equals in a safe space, in a dialogue setting. So that's also what I want to add. And it was mentioned here, it's where the power lies, where the money, the capacity is that has to invest on such kind of processes. So most of the points raised, I agree with.
We have to be realistic, but if we think out of the box, maybe Rakesh, what is the craziest idea you think? I mean, you've heard or you can come up with to allow new collaborators in?
I think using the tools that we have that are already out there that people use all the time. I think everybody listening to this and seeing me can pull out their phone and find the applications that are most important to them with just muscle memory. When looking at your phone, you can probably navigate to the top 2 or 3 apps that are really important to you as an individual. I think that we have to recognize that technology is fundamentally an inclusive actor or inclusive forcing factor, and that that can be both good or problematic. So, for example, it's not our emergency. Right, it's people's emergency. It's the local community. Every crisis is local, and so technology has allowed people both locally and around to organize and activate themselves with or without formal humanitarians. Right, so you don't choose whether these conversations happen or not. As someone earlier said before the break, they're going to happen with or without you. The question is whether you're there at the table or not. And so the technologies can do that. The other thing that I wanted to note is that, especially in situations of conflict, the bad guys get to innovate too. And this is really important. So while we're sitting here having conversations about how to adapt the system, somewhere else, a whole other set of conversations are happening to talk about how to target the system and how to exploit the system and the data and the trust relationships that we have. And so this notion of adaptability and how do we infuse adaptability into what we do is really, really important. And if we fail to adapt, if we fail to evolve ourselves, then I would argue that our organizations and our work may not be fit for purpose coming forward, because with climate change and other factors playing out, the crises are going to happen more frequently with more intensity, affecting more people. And so either we evolve and adapt, or we are not fit for purpose, and others will bypass us and route around us in order to get what needs to happen done.
Interesting. With that said, we didn't really hear much about the second question on new or underused collaborators and whether we should prioritize them into collaboration. So I'm interested to hear about that. Maybe from the panelists then, Louisa, Haile, Rakesh.
I'm actually going to set you up, Haile, because you were mentioning something just before they broke into the decision rooms about working with youth. And I hate to sound cliche for the future and all of this, but I think there's a lot of energy and engagement that we're missing when it comes to working with youth. And going back to one of the points of the group around, it's not about implementing programs with youth. I'm not talking about that. It's about bringing them into the discussions and the co-creation space to see how they're organizing their priorities, where they see really good entry points, and also to take, I mean, this is going to make me sound old, and I really didn't mean that, but just to keep your finger on the pulse of what's not just cool, but what's trusted. And there's organizations out there like Ground Truth asking questions about what's your most trusted information source, and we tend to look at that and analyze that and say women prefer to hear from community representative. Great, but fundamentally, how do they then see those different information sources and the different priorities shifting, and are they part of that decision process? I was reflecting back, trying to think, because we do a lot of talking about barriers and challenges, but I think personally one of the best programs we put together was in the western region of Darfur, simply because we had been there the year before, and they kept talking, all the communities there were talking about migration routes. There's a big issue around migration routes. They've been disrupted by the conflict. We don't have the infrastructure, all these things. And it kept coming back, and we were doing something completely different. And finally, over tea, we were like, well, what would you do about it? Like, oh, well, thank you for asking. This is what we would do. I was like, hang on, this is a really good idea. And so again, it took a lot of time, a lot of trust, a lot of relationships, but we turned it into a proposal that then a donor was really interested in funding. And that was not something that was mandated. The only reason we had that space is because we were already together. So I think, again, the leveraging those existing connections, we tend to be a little bit, trying to focus, okay, in an emergency, how do we identify the key actors, and we go in and get the right people. But those relationships already existed, and I really do think that, again, at the risk of sounding cliche, that there's a real potential in terms of youth networks and organization that may not be taken seriously, and that could be really leveraged in a more interesting way. And what that looks like will be different by context, but it certainly will involve some of the tech actors that Rakesh is talking about.
Thanks, Louisa. Haile, we saw quite a lot of our solutions were around meaningful participation, better engaging with people at decision-making fora. We said right in our introduction that there's this renewed energy on conversation of participation, localization, and engagement more broadly. There's lots of different terms that we use. What do you think, is there a difference between inclusion and collaboration? Full stop, question mark.
I'm afraid I might be lost in the definition. But for me, what is important is you're inclusive and you are ready to collaborate. So speaking from practical experience, in Switzerland, UNHCR Switzerland, we have now a refugee team. But what the purpose is, starting from next year, to include refugees, decisions that are being made within UNHCR of Switzerland. And we want to do it in a, on the levels of participation. We want to make them part of decisions. So now we are in the process of picking an initiative, or do we have to do parallel? We are in this process, but we want to showcase that it is possible, and we want to make the learning first and showcase that this is possible, include refugees, and when it comes to their problems and their needs, they are the experts. That's what we are trying to promote, and it takes willingness to do that.
An interesting stumble of accidentally excluding you from the meaning of my conversation, using a lot of terms. So thank you for pulling me up on that. Really important point. I'm going to redirect my question to Louisa as well in terms of the terminology we use, and it doesn't necessarily, isn't always clear. Is there a difference between inclusion and collaboration?
Really testing my English literature skills here. No, I think, a lot of people are talking about a safe and inclusive programming or including people. I think it's definitely, for me, the difference between inclusion as a principle and collaboration as an action. So inclusion talks a lot about kind of access and intent. They're meant to make sure that the programs are not excluding people. And the different ways in which people can be included are myriad. They can be participatory or not, actually. That's the thing about inclusion, is it's not necessarily about participation. Collaboration is that action, and then there necessarily needs to be, I think in both cases, but particularly with collaboration, this discussion around power and relationships and trust. And I think that's why that neo-colonialism and racism was so prominent, is because those are the ways we've found to identify the barriers to turning inclusion into more inclusive collaboration. And I think there's still a lot of work to be done about turning actual inclusion. Well, first of all, to make sure that programs really are inclusive, because by design, a lot of them may have considered certain groups but don't necessarily program for them. And then to turn that into collaboration, or co-creation is another big kind of buzzword, but I think it's a good one. As long as we identify that initiative, I think that's the important thing. We tend to talk about meaningful participation and collaboration in general. What are we collaborating on? Because that will tell you then who feels empowered to participate and how they can best contribute.
Thanks very much to both of you. And Rakesh, we're coming to you next. We are going to put up the final Slido, and this is a vote that our tech team have put together for us. So just a vote from us on where we got to in terms of the decision making. This is just as we wrap up today, I wanted to go to each of the panelists to see if there's anything that you weren't able to say today that you think is really crucial for us as we go on with this conversation in the coming days, and also as in our separate working lives. So Rakesh, maybe coming to you first, what are some of your final thoughts for us?
Thanks so much for, first of all, thank you all for moderating this and for inviting me to come and speak to all of you today. I think that we are in this sort of third phase of technology for humanitarian action. And from here on out, COVID-19 showed this, climate change and all the work going on at COP27 as we talk highlights this. Every crisis from here on out for the rest of our lives is going to be data-driven. There's going to be a technology component to every crisis. There's going to be data that is there. But you know, data is kind of this neutral thing. Whose story gets included and whose story is excluded from that data is really going to matter as to whether we are effective, equitable, and just in our humanitarian responses going forward. And I think we do need to broaden our lens to be much more intersectional, or what I did at Salesforce is say, we need to have not just a disaster response strategy, but a disaster justice strategy, or a crisis justice strategy, because that notion of justice is going to infuse our discussions with this notion of well, it's a moral quality, whether it's good or bad, or who's included, who's excluded. And so what I would ask all of you hearing this today is to consider how this notion of justice intersects with technology, because even coming out of the COVID-19 experience that we're still in, climate change is also going to be a massive data-driven crisis, and who we pay attention to and who we don't is really going to matter. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. And you spoke about who we're going to be paying attention to and who we're not going to be paying attention to. And I'm really glad that Louisa kind of highlighted the point about youth. I mean, we're here talking about future-proofing communication, and they are the future, right? So how do we include them in a meaningful way? Again, you know, so I think it'll be great for us to discuss this in the next couple of days, and how to actually actively engage them in different steps, in the different processes, and how to give them the ownership for future, response. Like we all say in the humanitarian development world, they're change agents, right? But how to truly make them change agents when we talk about community engagement, collaboration, coordination. So, Haile, I'd come to you for that, or any other point that you'd want to highlight, wrapping this up.
Not sure if I'm adding any value, but I just want to emphasize that often we forget about, the source of the cause, the root cause of the disaster or whatever. And this has been mentioned, the medias and so on. I want to re-emphasize that agents that are the cause of this crisis, I believe, are not contributing enough. At times, they are not even contributing anything when it comes to, disaster justice. I like this expression.
Just to note that I think you've spotted it, but this is the final Slido to the vote that we will show soon. So maybe Louisa, over to you. What do you think should be our key takeaways? And is there anything that you wanted to raise and you weren't able to?
Well, I feel like I'm really curious to hear more about the discussion that was going on online in your groups, because I think that's where the kind of scene is set for the rest of this event. But I would just say, don't discount the informal engagement that you as individuals, or your organizations, or different actors in a response have. We tend to want to formalize and to capture and to report on everything, but most of the most meaningful participation and exchanges and conversations and listening you have are informal. And so I would continue to want to embrace that. And then the final plea I would have, going back to Haile's point, but also what Rakesh was saying about this disaster justice, is that I'd really like to see a shift, just as we stop using the word beneficiary. I'd really like to see us stop using vulnerability and we start talking about capability. And we talk about whether capability is maybe being blocked or it's been kind of maybe lost or whatever it might be. But that just simple shift really, it may be a question of language or semantics, but it really does change the way we view people and then how we then include them in the conversation.
So as a final thought, these are many thanks for those of you who've been voting. This was a vote on the ideas that we came up with. So most of us agreeing that we can take more risks and that we need to start with more ideas. But actually enough of us believing that maybe we're talking from experience and we're talking from a space of feasibility, and you need to start somewhere. 3% saying, no, this is the best we can hope for. Heartbreaking. But most of us there, I mean, that's such an important point, isn't it? It's an important point for us to end. We do have experience. We're all coming from, I think we've talked today about perhaps not everyone's experience is reflected, but we need to start from somewhere. From myself, I'd just like to say a huge thanks to everybody who has participated, and thanks to Palwashay, but I'll leave you to wrap.
Thank you, Rosie. Okay. Thank you. Thank you to the panelists. Thank you, Louisa, Haile, Rakesh, Dana. Thank you for your time and for sharing your perspectives with us today. And many thanks to all of you who have joined us today for listening and contributing. And that obviously includes all our online participants. And as CDAC Network, we'll be taking this discussion forward into the next 2 days in the General Assembly. For anyone who may have missed this event, a reminder that it will be online on the CDAC website, and we will be producing a report on the key outcomes. So do join us as we continue the conversation over the coming years. Thank you again. This was really a pleasure.